First thing you'll need to do, unless of course you already own it, is to download Construct 2. So you'll need to go to Skera.com and then Store, Free Edition, and download the file. Then install it, and you're also going to need a plugin called Sprite Font for Construct 2. And I will be providing all of these links you'll need in the video description. So download spritefont.zip, unzip it, and you're going to need to put it into Construct 2 Exporters HTML5 plugins. Once Construct 2 and the Sprite Font plugin are ready to go, you're going to need the actual game engine I created, and you'll be able to download that from the link I provide in the video description. And once you download and unzip the game file and double click it, it should open up Construct 2 automatically, which should look something like this. If the start page is open, you can go ahead and close that by clicking here, and then you're going to see something like this. And this is the general Construct 2 interface. Over here you're going to see a Projects tab, and this is important to navigate around the different parts of the game engine. Layouts are basically each different screen. A screen can be a level or a menu screen or something like that. So by double clicking on any of these in the layouts list, you can go to that particular part of the game. And you should see a tab to open up the layers palette here, and if you've ever used a program like GIMP or Photoshop, you know in general how layers work. Basically, for a game level, this might be layers of scrolling. In this case, I have the sort of white mask out area that creates the fade in and fade out for any screen on this top layer, and then we have a middle layer that I named stuff in this case, and then we have a backmost layer with the scrolling cloud pattern. So you can hide and show layers, and more importantly you can lock layers so you don't accidentally click, move, or change or select something that you don't mean to be at the time. So here's how you can change artwork. Let's say you wanted to change the title. You wanted to replace this placeholder graphic of this game logo with your own. Okay, you can double click on it, and that will pull up several little windows here. We have the animation frames in case there's multiple frames. In this case there is. This object is used in two parts of the game for different things. This first frame is used for the title, and the second frame is used in the You Win screen. And then you have the actual area to edit things like the image itself and hotspot. There's no actual graphic editing here. You're going to want to create your art somewhere else, like in a graphic program like ProMotion or GIMP or Photoshop. And then you load it in with this button here. So you would just click on this little folder and then direct it toward the image you want to load in. And let's say, for instance, you for some reason wanted the title of the game to just be the letter E, and then you might want to adjust the hotspot, which is called an image point in Construct 2, and you just click to put that where you want it, and then close when you're done. And as you can see now, the game is called E. Okay, but let's say you want to replace something that's animated. Let's say you want to replace one animation with an animation that you've created. So I'm going to go to an actual level and hide the HUD layer that also has that big white sort of mask for fades. And then I'm going to lock these back layers because I don't want to select anything from there. And I want to be on the foreground layer. And let's say, for example, let's say I want to change this enemy so that instead of flying, so you can see these are his flying animation frames. Let's say I want him to be a shiny gem, since that's what I have available right now. It's convenient for me. I'm going to right click, and I deleted all frames but one with the delete key, and then I can right click and choose import frames, And now I can select sequential images. And I think somewhere in here I have, there we go, a big red shiny gem. So I can just use the shift key. So I click the first image, I hold shift, I click the last image, and I choose open, and as you can see it loads in all of those images sequentially. And it's important if you create your animation frames in an art program that they are all positioned exactly the same within the size of the entire image, what would be called canvas size in Photoshop. You want to make sure they're all positioned exactly the same as one another, so when you load them in and place your hotspot, so let's say, or image point it's called in Construct 2 again, let's say I want something like this down there, what would be the feet of this creature if it were still a creature. So I click down there, and then I right click on it in this image points box, and I choose apply to whole animation. So now that image point is the same across all, so we're not going to get any weird wiggling or sort of jumping around of the character between all of the frames. And for animations you create, you might need to tweak the actual speed of the animation. So this animation is called respawn, and the animation we changed into this gem is called default. And you'll notice if I click here, it's changing over here. This is the properties of that particular animation default. So you can adjust the speed, whether or not it loops or if it just stops at the last frame. And if it does loop, what frame it starts repeating to, and then how many times it repeats, and then whether or not it's ping-ponging, which would be going forward and then backward and then forward and backward. So not only do you have those really nice options to control your animation, but what's really cool is if you click on a specific frame, this right here, this frame speed, is the duration of that particular frame relative to the timing of the entire animation. So if you want that animation to apply to that frame of the animation to only show for half the time of any of the other frames, you could literally just change that to 0.5. Or if you want it to take twice as long, you can change it to 2. And so now you'll see when I run this frame, the enemies now look like shiny crystals until you stomp on them. And you can also import what are called animation strip images or sprite strips or sprite sheets. And to do that, you would go back into this to edit animation frames, delete all your unnecessary frames, import sprite strip, and then let's say we want to make him into a pixel art walking little robot character, because that's what I have available. Number of horizontal cells, 8, vertical cells 1, so you just tell it how many, basically how your sprite sheet is divided. Click OK, and it'll automatically cut them out so long as the sprite strip is arranged appropriately, with each frame taking the same space and being placed appropriately. And then again, you're going to probably want to do something like that for the hotspot. And then right click, quick assign, apply to whole animation. And there's something I haven't mentioned yet, which is really important for any kind of game sprite that is going to be interacted with, and that is the collision mask. By default, when you load an image, you might end up with something like this, where it's just making a rectangle around the entire image size. And most of the time for a game, you want to have something more like this. And the nice thing is you don't have to do this for every frame. So once you've clicked here to edit your collision polygon, you can actually right click within the polygon itself and also choose apply to whole animation. And now you'll see that that collision box is in the same place for all animations. And when we go back to the image points, the image point is also the same in all animations. All frames of the animation. Okay, so now when I run this layout, instead of those flying enemies being gems, oops, I need to refresh. That's another important thing to keep in mind when you're running the frame. If your art is not updated, just refresh your browser. It's just not, running the game that is in your buffer instead of loading the latest version of the game. So you'll see now the enemies are your walking robot animation that was loaded in from a strip. So the collision, defining your collision areas aren't only important for enemies and things like that. It's going to be really important when you change the environment art, these tiles here. So let me go back here and zoom back in, and let's see, foreground is unlocked, so I can choose a tile, and if I double click it opens up the editor. So let's say I change this image. When I load in a new image, this is probably not going to be set properly anymore. So you need to be consistent. If all of your tiles are collidable here, all the way at the top, you need to make sure they're all aligned properly like this. In my case, I want the player character and enemies to be partially inside the tile, so their feet land here on the ground instead of up on top here. So just be careful when you're editing environment art to make sure the collisions are correct, because if some of your tiles have it up here and some have it down here, when you put the tiles side by side, the character is going to stop. He's going to hit this edge here on one tile because he's walking low on one tile, and then the whole the entire of another tile, the entirety of another tile is collidable, and that's going to cause issues. So just make sure you're consistent with where the collisions are for a tile, and make sure you edit that every time you load in new art for a tile. Another trick about the tiles that's really important to keep in mind is it's based on a 32 by 32 pixel grid, and to use grids, if you want to move tiles around or rearrange a level, you go into View and you choose Snap to Grid, and you set that to 32 by 32, like so. And now when I move a tile around, it makes sure it puts it in the right place. But because this game engine uses hardware acceleration, it uses filtering, and it can zoom in and out. And because of that, you can get these annoying gray seams in between your tiles. So to correct for that, the trick I used is to make the tiles actually 33 by 33 pixel instead of 32 by 32, with the action point, or image point I should say, at the very top left. So basically they overlap, the tiles overlap by 1 pixel on the right side and the bottom. It's just something to get used to, but it basically ensures no matter what happens in your browser, no matter how the game gets scaled, you don't see any nasty gray seams in between all of your tiles. Okay, so that's the basics for changing artwork with existing objects, but the really cool thing about this game engine is you're free to not only delete things where you don't want them, or add things or move things around. I should let you know, when you're editing a level and you want to add another tile, you can simply choose a tile that's already there, make sure you have the right layer selected, and then hold Control, and now when you drag, and remember I have Snap to Grid on, when you drag, it'll just make a copy of what you've dragged instead of moving it. So you can place them wherever you want to. So that's how you can add more tiles very easily to change a level around. The same thing works with enemies or something like that. If I want an enemy somewhere else, I can just hold Control, click and drag, and put the new enemy copy wherever I need to. So that's how you do that. But what I'm talking about is adding new objects to your game. And you just decide what layer you want to add your object on, and there are two ways. The easiest way is to double click, and remember I have these two layers locked, so it's going to be more foolproof for me. I'm not going to accidentally click and select them because I don't want. So whichever layer you're on, if you click where there's no object quickly, if you double click with the left mouse button, it'll bring up the Insert New Object menu. And then you would choose Sprite most of the time. And then when you click, it's going to bring up the Sprite animation editing windows, and then you can load anything you want to. And I haven't pre-planned this, so now I have to quickly find some kind of image to load in. So let's say for some reason, okay, effects, that'll be a little less distracting. Let's say that this is some kind of weird plant or something that is animated, for example, and I want it's quite high res, sorry about that. But you can also scale like this if you want to, but it's going to keep that whole giant image in memory. So obviously it's best to make your actual images the resolution you want in the game. But just as an example, I've imported my new object. It could be an animated flower or whatever, and you just want it to be a prop in the background. So let's say I want it there, but obviously the problem is if I want it on this layer with the characters and stuff, by default when you insert a new object, it's on top of everything else. But if you right click on it and choose Z order, you can send it to the bottom of the layer, and for some reason sometimes it takes twice to make it happen. But as you can see now, it's behind everything else. I'm grabbing other stuff accidentally, but there. You can see it's now behind everything else on that layer. And I'm going to run the layout again, and I'm probably going to have to refresh it. And when I refresh it, hopefully we'll see that object. There it is. So you're completely free to add as many animated or static objects as you want to any of the layers, anywhere you want, to really pretty up the game. And that's the basics for bringing in your own artwork and customizing and prettying up the game. One more important thing to keep in mind with tiles, when you create your own tile set, I've only created very, very few tiles, so you're probably going to want a lot more variety. So when you're creating additional tiles, what you're going to want to make sure you do is not only make sure the collision polygon is set properly for each tile, but the most important thing, and let me show you what I mean. I just made this a little wider so we can read it more easily. If you go here on any sprite, if you select it and you look in its properties under behaviors, by default there's none, and you would need to click add or edit, click on the plus, and choose solid, which is, oh, it's not here, it's not visible. It would be here at the top, but it's not here because it's already there. So I'm going to cancel that. But basically for a platform you have two options, jump through and solid. Most of the time you want solid, but if you want to add platforms to the game where the character can jump up through them and then as he's falling he'll land on them, then jump through is the one you want. So obviously that's going to be really important. If you add in new tiles that look nice, even though your collision is set properly, if you do not give them a behavior as solid or jump through, then your player and the enemies are going to fall right through it, and that's not going to be a very fun game to play. So that's the basics for bringing in your own art, as I said. That's all the really important things. If your game starts playing in a bizarre manner, keep in mind the two things. Do you have it set to solid or jump through if you're supposed to be able to collide with it and land on it and walk on it? And otherwise, the collision polygons is another very likely cause of issues in the game. Make sure, for instance, when you're changing art for enemies and things of that sort, before you change the art, take a close look at how I set up the collision rectangles relative to the image art and the image points. Where are they relative to the image art? And you should try to duplicate the general idea of where I placed those two things, because that can have a pretty big impact on how the game runs, on what it's doing when the game runs. The next series of videos I'll be making will explain how to actually change gameplay elements in Construct 2 in this game engine. If you look here, these layouts are the different, basically the different screens for the game, like menu screens and levels, as I said before. but under them you'll see event sheets, and event sheets are the actual what's called events. It's basically the lines of code that affect what's actually happening in the game. And the next series of videos I make are actually going to explain how to add very typical aspects to the game that are very common to platformers, like a double jump and perhaps a wall jump and stuff like that. But in the meantime, if you want to start to learn more about Construct 2 and how to start to program your own games from scratch and just get a better feeling for it, be sure to go to Skera.com and check out the tutorial section. And I'll also provide a link in the video description where you can find some really good video tutorials that are really easy to sort of dive in and start to learn Construct 2. And one last thing I just thought of were all of you hardcore pixel artists out there that do not want their game scaled and filtered, that want to actually show off every last pixel they've placed in their artwork. You can actually set Construct 2 to display the game in that fashion. So you can make all of your art as actual non-anti-aliased pixel art and import it in, and once your game is all loaded into Construct, once all of your art is in Construct 2, I should say, then what you need to do is go into the main folder here for the project, and that'll bring up these properties here, and you want to make sure that pixel rounding is turned on. That'll make sure that nothing is ever placed in sort of half a pixel placement, which will cause filtering. And then the other important thing is to go to full screen in browser mode and turn it off. And once you do those two things, also make sure sampling is turned to point instead of linear. And basically that's going to turn off scaling, and it's going to turn off filtering as much as possible. So now when I run the game, and I'm going to have to refresh it most likely, yes. But now you'll see the game runs in an actual letterbox, and the scrolling is less smooth and stuff like that because it's not filtering and actually scrolling in partial pixel placements, but it's actual pixel art. And so now when you load the game, you can see it's nice and crisp, and it's showing the actual pixels that the artist has created. And that's it. I hope you have a lot of fun with this, and as soon as I get a chance, I'll make more videos.